It's run by the Communist Party of China, or CPC. At the top of the power pyramid is the Politburo Standing Committee, composed of 9 men.
Few words in the modern vocabulary carry as much weight or as much confusion as this one. Politicians use it as an insult. Professors debate it in seminar rooms. It's trending on TikTok. It's printed on T-shirts. It's been used to justify revolutions, justify crackdowns, justify wars, and justify silence. The word is communism. And here's the problem. Most people who hold a strong opinion about it, for or against, can't tell you precisely what it is. Not really, not beyond a bumper sticker. So today, we're going back to where it started. We're going to look at the idea itself, clearly without the shouting, and then follow it out of the library and into the real world, where things got considerably more complicated. And this is what communism actually is. To understand communism, you have to understand the world that made Karl Marx angry. It's the mid-1800s. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing across Western Europe: London, Paris, Brussels, Vienna. On paper, this is progress. New factories, new machines, new jobs, unprecedented economic growth. Walk into one of those factories, though, and the picture changes. Workers, including children, are putting in 16-hour days for wages that barely cover rent in overcrowded urban slums. No safety regulations, no unions with real teeth, no weekends. Get injured on the floor, you lose your job. The machines keep running. The people who own the factories are doing extraordinarily well. None of this was hidden. Friedrich Engels, a German industrialist's son who would become Marx's closest collaborator, published The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. It was a detailed, ground-level account of what factory life actually looked like. Not abstract theory, reporting. This is the soil communism grew in, not in a philosophy classroom, in a factory town. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany. Philosopher, economist, journalist, and by most accounts, a difficult person. He was also prolific. Across thousands of pages, he was doing one thing: trying to understand how capitalism worked and why it produced misery alongside wealth. His answer was a theory he called historical materialism. The short version: the engine of history is class conflict. The people who control the means of production, the factories, the land, the resources, hold power over everyone else. That tension between the owners and the workers doesn't just create poverty. It defines entire societies, their politics, their laws, their culture. In 1848, Marx and Engels wrote a 23-page pamphlet that would become one of the most influential political documents in human history, the Communist Manifesto. It opens with one of the most recognized lines in political literature: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." It closes with a call that still echoes: "Workers of the world, unite." Between those two lines, Marx and Engels lay out their argument. History is the story of class struggle. The current ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist owners, exploits the working class, the proletariat, just as feudal lords exploited serfs before them. But this system carries the seeds of its own collapse. Eventually, the workers will develop what Marx called class consciousness, an awareness of their collective exploitation, and they will revolt. Capitalism falls. And what replaces it? A classless society, one where the means of production are owned collectively, where the state itself, over time, becomes unnecessary and dissolves, where the governing principle is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That is communism, the destination Marx was describing. And this is where the gap between theory and practice begins to open. Marx believed revolution would happen first in the most advanced industrial nations: Britain, Germany, places where capitalism had developed furthest and its internal contradictions were most exposed. That's not what happened. The first communist revolution succeeded in Russia.
Russia, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, was a country in absolute turmoil. A brutal and bloody clash of arms trying to wipe out this new regime before it can take control of the country.
One of the least industrialized major powers on Earth, still largely feudal, ruled by a monarchy that had just led its people into the disaster of the First World War. By 1917, the country was collapsing. Widespread hunger, mass casualties at the front, a czar who had lost the confidence of almost everyone. Into that vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin, leader of a faction called the Bolsheviks. Lenin had his own modification of Marx's theory. He didn't believe you could wait for spontaneous class consciousness to develop naturally. You needed a disciplined, professional revolutionary party to act as a vanguard, to lead the working class, even before conditions were fully ready. That modification matters. It planted the seed of authoritarianism right at the foundation. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. The following year, Lenin launched what became known as the Red Terror, a campaign of organized violence against political opponents. He established the Cheka, a secret police force. Censorship was imposed. One-party rule took hold. The Constituent Assembly, which had been democratically elected, was dissolved in January 1918. Lenin died in 1924. The power struggle that followed eventually produced Joseph Stalin. His rule, from roughly 1929 to 1953, delivered industrialization, a superpower, gulags, forced collectivization, mass famine, and purges that killed tens of millions of people. The classless, stateless society Marx had described, the Soviet Union moved in the opposite direction. The state grew larger. The hierarchy grew steeper. The repression grew more systematic. The Soviet model didn't stay in Russia. After the Second World War, Soviet-aligned communist parties were installed across Eastern Europe. In 1949, following a civil war, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China. Communist states followed in Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. By the middle of the 20th century, more than one-third of the world's population was living under governments that called themselves communist. Each country produced its own version. Mao adapted the theory for an agrarian peasant society rather than an industrial one. His Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976, targeted intellectuals and purged party officials in an attempt to enforce ideological conformity. The death toll from famine and violence during Mao's rule is a matter of genuine historical dispute, but by most serious estimates, it runs into the tens of millions. Cambodia, under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, from 1975 to 1979, represents the most extreme case per capita. Out of a population of roughly 7 million, the regime killed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, an annual murder rate exceeding 8% of the population. Cities were forcibly evacuated. Intellectuals were executed for wearing glasses. Cuba's Fidel Castro nationalized foreign-owned property, banned private business, and restricted political activity, while simultaneously building a free healthcare and education system that achieved outcomes rivaling far wealthier nations. Every country that implemented communism produced a different version. Not one of them produced what Marx had described. We need to spend a moment on the death toll, because that number gets repeated constantly, and it deserves honest treatment. In 1997, a team of French historians published a work called The Black Book of Communism. It attempted to count all deaths attributable to communist regimes across the 20th century. The introduction put the figure at approximately 100 million people. That number has been widely cited ever since. It is also genuinely contested among serious historians. Critics, including several of the book's own contributors, argued that the lead author was inflating figures, combining executions, famine deaths, wartime casualties, and forced labor deaths in ways that stretched the definition of what constitutes a communist-caused death. 3 of the book's main contributors publicly distanced themselves from the introduction. What is not contested is this: the Soviet Union, Communist China, and Cambodia's Khmer Rouge were responsible for some of the deadliest episodes of government-caused death in the 20th century. The mechanisms, executions, forced labor camps, engineered famines, mass deportations, are documented. The scale is enormous, regardless of where the final count lands. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. The economy was stagnating. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and lives. The gap between official ideology and daily reality had grown impossible to sustain. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, as a last attempt to stabilize the system. What they did instead was release decades of suppressed pressure. In 1989, the communist states of Eastern Europe collapsed, one after another. The Berlin Wall fell. Then, on December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet Union was dissolved. Boris Yeltsin banned the Communist Party. As a global political force, communism had effectively ended. 5 countries remain under Communist Party rule today: China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam. But none of them claim to have achieved communism. They describe themselves as socialist states working toward communism. Several, particularly China and Vietnam, have incorporated extensive market reforms and private ownership into their economies. China hosts stock exchanges and billionaires. Vietnam has attracted significant foreign investment since its economic opening in 1986. The Communist Party maintains political control. The economy increasingly does not look communist. Here's what the history of communism actually shows. Marx's diagnosis was pointed. The Industrial Revolution was producing extraordinary suffering alongside extraordinary wealth. The structural critique of how capitalism concentrates power and property became a serious intellectual tradition that shaped economics, sociology, and political theory for over a century. But the prescription, and more critically, the implementation, is where it came apart. Every attempt to build a communist society produced a vanguard that became a ruling class. Every attempt to abolish private property produced a state apparatus that accumulated power rivaling anything it had replaced. The stateless, classless society remained on paper. The purges and the famines did not. So, what is communism? In theory, a classless, stateless society where production is collectively owned and goods are distributed according to need, not profit. A world where the exploitation Marx documented in those English factory towns is permanently, structurally over. In practice, the most ambitious, the most violent, and arguably the most consequential political experiment of the 20th century. One that reshaped every continent, defined the Cold War, killed enormous numbers of people, and still, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the reforms in China, after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, has never actually been achieved. Not once, not anywhere. The gap between what communism promised and what it produced is one of the defining questions of modern history. And it's a question we're still, in different ways, living inside. That's the story of communism. We're going to keep pulling on that thread.